This was 2010. I had just had my first baby, and I was on maternity leave. I'm a young mum. I was 21 at the time. We had just bought our first home, and my boyfriend was working ridiculous hours, leaving at around 6:30 AM, and was rarely home before 10:30 PM. On this particular night, he hadn't come home, and it was nearing 11 PM. Sitting with my baby on my lap and my dog Belle, a beautiful Australian shepherd, I heard a knock at the door. This is where I made a big mistake. Holding my newborn, I walked straight up to the door and opened it. I was expecting my boyfriend to be there. Instead, standing there was an older man, in his 50s, balding and average build. He seemed caught off guard and wouldn't stop staring at my baby. He introduced himself as my next door neighbor. This immediately made me feel uncomfortable. We had just moved in, and I met the neighbors on both sides. On either side were young couples buying their first house. There was no older man in either one. I took a step back, and the man started to shift, and randomly started asking me if my TV reception was bad. I'm too nice. I felt alarm bells, but I was too concerned about being polite. At this point, my dog Belle ran up to the door. She ignored the man standing in the door, and looked a bit further down the road, and she started to growl. She never does this. I looked in the direction she was looking at, and I saw the figure of a man hiding behind a tree. I couldn't make anything out since it was so dark outside, but I saw the tip of a cigarette light up when the tree man took a drag. I looked back up at the man at my door, and I put two and two together. I said I didn't know anything about the TV reception, but my boyfriend would, and he was just upstairs. I shut the door, and I locked it. I ran around the house, checking all of the other locks as well. I think I was saved because this creep had some form of morals and didn't want to attack a woman holding a newborn baby. They also could have been deterred by my dog. If it wasn't for Belle, I wouldn't have seen the man hiding in the darkness, and I may have continued the conversation, allowing the creep to get over his initial shock.
This happened when I was about 14 or 15 years old. My school has an option. If it's too far for you to travel to school, you can always opt to stay in the hostel. You pay a certain amount of money monthly, and on alternate weekends, they'll let you off to see your parents or go to town to hang out or get some personal supplies. So this is in an all-girls school. At the hostel, we experienced change of guards a lot of times after our previous guard passed away. The late guard was a nice chap and acted more like a grandfather to us. He's in his late 50s to early 60s. He would bring us food from his wife and candy. Till one day, a man in his 30s took the guard post after quite some time with the hostel being without one. The new guard was a bit off. There are times when he would walk past our study room and stand by the window staring at us. Other times, he'll stay outside the gate near the shower room smoking cigarettes. It creeps us a little, but we didn't really do much as the wardens are also wary that we won't be able to get a new guard if they fire him. So he stays. Whenever he's around and we get uncomfortable, we'll just close the door to the room we are in so that he could not peer inside. Fast forward to a few months after, our panties started going missing. We have this place right behind our hostel block that's located for us to hang our laundry and air it to dry after we did them. Some girls will soak their clothes in the softener for a night and leave the clothes, including panties, in a pail in the laundry room. The next day, when we wake up, all of our panties will be missing. It went on for weeks, and we started getting anxious about the missing panties. It comes to a point where a few girls were left with only a few panties with them. They had to give their parents an emergency call to buy them more and to send it to the hostel. Our wardens were getting anxious as well. We alerted the school and local enforcement, but not much is being done. We were mostly left on our own. One weekend, 2 girls went behind the guardhouse to get some cleaning stuff. We clean up part of the hostel every alternate weekends when we don't have our outings, and they noticed a large garbage bag. They left it untouched at first, but when they returned to put back the brooms and mops they had used, one girl got curious to what's in the bag and decided to take a look. Inside, there were heaps of our missing panties. Both girls freaked out when they see the young guard coming towards them, yelling some profanities and asked them not to touch the bag. Both ran towards the main hostel building, straight to our warden's room. Our wardens were both alarmed and called the police straight away. Then, armed with a few burly girls, with their hockey sticks in tow, they went to look for him. The guard managed to get away on his motorcycle. A few days later, the police caught him snooping around our hostel when it was almost lights off. It turns out that he was actually a repeated sex offender. He got caught a few times being a flasher around the schools in the city too. We were all relieved to have him locked away in jail, but also upset that our school has been so careless in hiring guards for the hostel. Our parents demanded for PTA emergency meetings and decided that the next one they hire has to go through PTA approval first. It was scary to imagine that this guy has the keys to almost all the rooms in the hostel, except for the dorms, where a dorm leader is given the keys to lock the door after lights out from inside. But imagine what nasty things he would have been up to if the 2 girls didn't discover the missing panties. After all, this man has been entrusted to guard us from harm, but he turned out to be the danger lurking around. I still have shivers down my spine when I think of him.
When I was younger, each summer and almost every New Year, my family would pack the car and go on a road trip to visit my family in Mexico. We never had any problems, until one particular trip, when I was 8. Like every road trip before, we left our home in North Texas at around 6 p.m. in order to reach our destination the next morning. So, at around 2 a.m., we crossed into Mexico. And that's when things got weird. When you're on the only stretch of freeway in the middle of the desert, you don't tend to freak out about having the same car behind you for miles. It was practically pitch black outside of our car windows, the only visible shapes being the dotted stars and the eerie silhouettes of the cacti. We'd been in Mexico for about an hour, and still had a few more to drive, and I remember sleeping, but still being semi-conscious of what was going on around me. So when my mother suddenly spoke my dad's name, I heard her. "Miguel, that car behind us. It's been behind us since we left Laredo." My dad peeked at the car and shrugged it off. "A lot of cars use this road. He's probably going to Reynosa or another city." Despite his sureness, my mum kept a wary eye on the car behind us. By this time, my siblings and I were hyper aware of the car behind us, and entertained ourselves by watching the car through the gaps in the luggage that blocked the rear window. We got tired pretty quickly. "He's getting closer," my mother noted, and we turned to watch as the car inched closer and closer to ours. "He's too close, Miguel." And she was right. By this time, the car was practically pressed against the rear of ours, and on a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere, with another few hours until daylight, and it was downright scary. We couldn't do much. My dad didn't slow down, didn't stop, and he didn't speed away either. He just drove, and the car followed. The next 30 minutes were the most tense we had ever experienced. The car would ease off sometimes, only to press its blinding headlights against our rear once more, like he knew he was freaking us out, and enjoying it. It was during one of the periods that the car had pulled away that my mum spotted a police car up ahead, parked on the side of the road. and she didn't miss a beat. "Pull over, right in front of the police. Pull over right now, Miguel." And he did, and the car kept driving. I wonder how confused the policeman must have been as he watched my dad park our car right in front of him. The policeman came over and asked what was wrong, and my mother urgently told him everything. The policeman took her claim seriously and told us of how people were victimized and had their cars stolen on these empty highways by thugs and criminals. He then offered to drive behind us for a while to make us feel safe. We drove off with the police cruiser behind us, relieved, until about 10 minutes later, when we saw something that confirmed the policeman's words and my mother's worst fears. 10 minutes later, we saw the car pulled over on the side of the road, waiting.
When I was 9, I lived in a small town that was almost entirely forest. Most of the people in the town were very old and kind, so things like this weren't at all normal. My family was fairly poor when I was young, so we all lived in one of those apartments above shops. None of us really minded, as it was pretty nice. It had a nice living room, a large room where we all stayed in what would be considered a backyard that was only accessible from the apartment. My sister, who at the time was 12, and I would play in it all the time. One day, while we were playing outside, we heard a noise that sounded like an animal grunting on the other side of the fence. Animals would go on the outside of the fence a lot, so we just ignored it and kept playing. Suddenly, our dad yells at us to come in. We argue a little, but he eventually picks us up and brings us inside himself. The next night, I hear a noise outside the window and I wake my sister up and ask her to look out there for me. When she looks out there, she says she sees nothing and then goes back to sleep. After around a week of strange noises and sightings in our backyard, I convince my parents to stay awake with me and wait for them. Eventually they come, and when we looked outside, I can only describe myself as being frozen with fear. There was a man who was very tall sitting and watching me and my family through that window, and who was probably watching me and my sister in our backyard every day since then. I was reminded of this story earlier this week when I finally chose to ask my dad why he had brought us in that day. There had been reports of a man who had broken into a house and kidnapped 2 young girls, who were later found the same day, one nearly dead, the other with extreme injuries, in a ditch less than a block away from our house. The man was later caught that month when trying to get into another house. I don't remember his name or even what he looked like, but I'll never forget seeing that terrifying silhouette outside my window, staring directly at me.
This happened to me about a week ago. Honestly, it was one of the freakiest encounters of my life. This is 10 billion% true, despite how much it sounds like a no-sleep kind of story. It might sound fake to a lot of people, and all I have is my word, but I swear on my life, and the life of everyone I love, that this is true. Last week, I took my dog to this fenced-off dog park. I tried to go around 5 or 6 p.m, because that's when most people get off work and bring their dogs, so there's a large amount of dogs for my puppy to socialize and play with. It rained earlier in the day, but it stopped, so I was surprised to see only one other person in the dog park. I knew both him and his dog, and we chatted for a bit while our dogs chased each other around. Also worth mentioning, the atmosphere was just so creepy. A low, thick fog covering the entire dog park. It was that horrible weather that's somehow both humid and cold. Just a dreary, rainy fall day. It wasn't that dark yet, so when the guy and his dog left, I decided to stay for a while and play fetch with mine. That was mistake number 1. I throw the ball around for a bit, and on one throw, something caught my eye. There was a man, in all black, hood up, standing at the fence, completely still, facing towards me. I couldn't see his face, so I don't know if he was looking at me. I tried to brush it off, assuming he was just watching us playing fetch. I do have a 5-month-old puppy after all, who is adorable and draws a lot of attention. I threw the ball in his direction a few more times, so that I could glance at him and see if he would move on. No, he never did. At that point, I started to get pretty freaked out. I didn't want to stay alone in a dog park with only one entrance. It was significantly darker at this point as well. I really wanted to get out of there, but in order to leave, I'd have to walk right past this man. Here's a shitty diagram I drew, because it's hard to explain sometimes. The scale's completely off, but hopefully you get the gist. The dog park only has one entrance on one side. So, I gather my stuff and begin to leave. I walk to the entrance, glancing at him every few seconds, and he's still standing there, completely still, but now he's turned more towards me. I took out my phone and pretended to be talking to someone, saying things like, "Oh yeah, I'll be there in 20 minutes. 15? That's too soon. Okay, Dad, I'll try." The moment I left the dog park, he turned and started walking away towards the parking lot. I was relieved, but only for a moment. He wasn't walking, he was shuffling, only a few feet at a time. Then he would stop completely, turn around and look at me, and then keep going. He repeated this 3 or 4 times. Then his walking changed. He started throwing his head back, looking up at the sky, repeatedly, rhythmically, and then taking huge strides forward. His movements were very bizarre, an exaggerated tiptoe-like walk. If you've ever read The Smiling Man, it reminded me of that. Exactly like that. Except he was moving slow, not fast. The moment he started doing it, that story was the first thing to pop into my head. And still, every 5-10 feet or so, he would look back at me. I was walking behind him, slowly, in the same direction, towards my car. Needless to say, I was pretty much 100% convinced I was going to be raped, stabbed, robbed, kidnapped, whatever. I was scared to death. My whole body was tense and cold. I've never felt that kind of fear in my entire life. Like deep, horrible, pit of your stomach, I could die tonight kind of fear. Then, suddenly, he turns sharp and runs into the trees along the path. I took this opportunity to pick up the pace, and I passed the spot where he ran into the trees. Mistake number 2. Barely seconds after I passed him, I hear a rustling, and he's coming out of the trees. A fast, curt power walk straight towards me. This is where I noped the fuck out, and I just started sprinting. I was only about 30 yards from my car. I scooped up my dog and jumped into the driver's seat, started my car, locked the doors, and peeled out of there as fast as I could. As I was backing up out of my parking space, the lights shined for just a second on the man, who was standing at the end of the path, completely still, just staring. I may or may not have called my mum up and cried the entire way home. I did. I was so shaken up, I didn't want to walk around at night for a few days afterwards. Even writing this made me incredibly uncomfortable. I've told people that I frequently see there about the encounter. And now, I make sure I am never the last person to leave the dog park.
This happened to me a few months ago on a trip I was taking to see my grandparents, and I take the Natchez Trace Parkway to their house. For those who aren't familiar with it, it's a national parkway that's surrounded by woods for a lack of better description. Along the parkway there are many places you can pull off and see landmarks of American history, most having to do with Native American Indians. There are no stores or gas stations along the parkway without having to exit off and drive a few miles to the nearest town. They do, however, have several bathrooms on the trace for travelers. For this trip, I was alone, since my husband had to work. I had left my grandparents' house and was about 45 minutes into my drive when I realized the large drink I had gotten at a fast food place was a huge mistake. I had to pee, like really, really bad. When I got closer to the restrooms, I decided to pull in and look around to see if anyone was there. My bladder felt like it was about to explode, and I really thought that I might have an accident if I tried to make it to the next town. So I pull in and immediately notice a Parkway Ranger parked at the restroom, along with another vehicle. I figured since the Ranger was there, I'd be safe to run in and use the restroom quickly. I got out of my car and caught the Ranger's eye. He nodded his head to me, so I locked the door and went inside the restroom. I was thinking that he would stay until I left the restroom, so I felt completely safe. When I got into the stall, I heard a car start up, and I thought it was the other vehicle that was sitting in the lot. I was very wrong. Not 15 seconds later, the door opened, and someone started banging on the stall door. I was mid-pee, and I had to go so bad I couldn't stop. I could see a pair of men's shoes under the stall door, and two very large, hefty legs. He wasn't saying anything, just banging on the door. I finished as quickly as I could, got my pants pulled up, and then just froze. I didn't know what to do. It was obviously the Ranger who had driven away, and God knows who this guy was. He was banging on the door, not saying a word. I finally found my voice and asked what he wanted. He told me to come out of the stall. His voice sounded so calm compared to the banging. I yelled at him that I had my phone with me, and I was going to call 911. He just kept banging and calmly telling me to come out of the stall. I was praying the latch wouldn't break. I unfortunately, stupidly, didn't actually have my phone with me, but I still pretended to call 911 and talk to a dispatcher. The man stopped banging and I heard him run out of the restroom. I waited a minute, what felt like an hour, and heard his vehicle start up, so I decided to run to my car. I got my keys ready, and as soon as I opened the door, I unlocked my car and ran as fast as I could to get in. I immediately locked the doors and started my car. The man was in his truck, still parked in the lot, so I grabbed my phone and I called 911. They told me to wait right there while they transferred me to the Ranger's dispatch. Well, I guess the man saw that I got my phone and realized that I hadn't called when I was in the restroom, so he jumped out of his truck and he started coming towards my car. I was still waiting to talk to the other dispatcher, but there was no way I was going to just sit there while this man tried to break into my car, so I reversed out of the lot into the road. I was focused on driving and telling her everything that had happened, and that a Ranger was there about 5 minutes earlier. She told me to hold on while she tried to find the Ranger who was there, and I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the truck right behind me. I screamed into the phone to tell the dispatcher, but I guess I was on hold because she didn't come back on the line for another 30 seconds or so. When she came back, I was screaming that he was right behind me, and she began trying to calm me down. She said the Ranger was just down the road from me, and to put my flashers on so that when I passed him, he would know who to help. When I put my flashers on, the man slowed down and got further behind me. I'd gone about a mile when I saw the Ranger. He got behind the truck, and the man just pulled over. I pulled over about 500 feet in front of them and watched as the Ranger made the man get out of his truck, handcuff him, and put him in the police car. The Ranger then came to talk to me, and said that the man claimed it wasn't him and just denied everything. Luckily, the Ranger recognized him as he was in the parking lot when I pulled up. The Ranger told me I could go, so I left and went home. I haven't heard what happened to the man, if anything. I've never driven on the Trace by myself since, and I always make sure to use the restroom before I leave my grandparents'. I still have no idea why the Ranger left the parking lot. I was too shaken up to even ask.
A little bit of background. I was 17 when this happened. I'm a male, but when I was 17, I was very slender and androgynous looking. Still kind of am in some respects. At the time, I lived in this old neighborhood with these weird back alleys behind all of the houses. Back in the day, they were used by the milkman, but nowadays, it's mostly for cars, and people use them as a walking/biking shortcut. So me and my dad were raking leaves in the backyard, and getting ready to put up this parking tent for my mom before winter. I live in Canada, and some years we get enough snow to bury the car. As we're working, a man shows up in the back alley with a bike. We don't notice him at first, but I guess he just kinda stood there for a bit watching us rake leaves. We finally noticed him when he piped up and said, "Hi, I have a bike." We were both startled by this, but I figured this guy had some kind of developmental issues. He kinda sounded like a little kid. My dad's a therapist though, so he was really nice to the guy and introduced us to him. I was a little put off by him though, so I stayed back while my dad shook his hand. Even though he was talking to my dad, he kept staring at me and repeating, "I have a bike! See my bike?" As if he really wanted me to be proud of him for his fucking bike. I think my dad could tell I was a bit freaked out, so he cut the conversation short, and the guy left, after staring at us for a bit longer. Or more specifically, me. So fast forward about 2 or 3 days later. I'm walking home from school, and I'm only about a block away from my house, when I hear someone calling my name. I look around for the source, and I see the guy from before, standing in the middle of the yard of this huge old house that must have been beautiful once, but is in severe disrepair. He rushed over to me shouting, "Hi!" repeatedly. I'm kind of in shock at this point, and I don't know what to do. I really didn't want to come off as rude. Clearly this guy is mentally ill, but he seems harmless. Or so I thought. He starts gesturing to this big house and saying, "See, this is my business," which I find it really hard to believe. It was just a house. He hands me a flip phone and tells me to look at all the pictures I've taken. Still, not wanting to be rude, I begin to look. As I'm doing so, he's still yammering on about something, but I've stopped listening. On his phone there are dozens and dozens of pictures of me walking home from school, all on different days. He must have been watching me for weeks. Some of these even look like they were from the year before. I look up to confront this creep, but he's walking back to the house, looking at me with this big smile on his face. Thoroughly freaked out, I extend my hand with the phone as far away from me as possible and sort of sidestep over to him and shove the phone back into his hand and fucking run. Looking back, I should have just dropped the phone and booked it, but for some reason I thought I was being stealthy, I guess. Honestly, it must have looked ridiculous. For the rest of the year after that, I took a different route home. He still walked by my house a couple of times every day for a few months, sometimes just stopping and staring at the house from the middle of the street. But eventually it stopped. Sometimes I wonder if he was institutionalized. I never told my dad what happened because I didn't want him to blame himself. Also, at the time, I think I shoved it to the back of my mind. It wasn't until years later that I realized just how fucked up that situation was. He was clearly trying to lure me over to his house by leaving me with his phone. Sometimes I wonder if he was actually planning something malicious, or if he just didn't realize how creepy that was. I'm also pretty sure he thought I was a girl.
I live on a huge piece of property in the mountains. The land is shared with my boyfriend's parents. However, our house is towards the middle of the property. Their house is in the front. Our house is a ranch style. We have a shed outside our window, only 5 feet away. To see inside the back window, you'd have to be right next to the house. We're the only people for about a mile. For this reason, I don't normally care too much about leaving windows open or curtains open, since the only people here are his family, who would never go behind our house anyway. We share the house with my boyfriend's brother and his girlfriend. One night last week, we had the house to ourselves. His parents were asleep in their house, and our roommates went on a small getaway. Around 10 PM, we got bored of the solitude and decided to go to Walmart. I went to go and take a shower, and I returned to our room alone, while he finished doing some dishes halfway across the house. As I was drying my hair, at this point completely disrobed, I started to get chilly from the breeze coming in from the open window. I decided to only close the curtain to block some of the air out. The second I did, I heard a voice from outside yell, "What'd you do that for? I wasn't finished yet." I screamed, and I ran out of the room, telling my boyfriend what just happened. He grabbed a knife and checked outside. He didn't see anything. He told me it had to have been my imagination. As a precaution, he locked the windows for me and stayed with me as I got changed. We left the house about 10 minutes after I heard that voice. We were out for about 2 hours. When we pulled back in, he saw a shadow moving behind our house. He quickly drove towards it, only to see a man we've never seen before get into a car we didn't recognize and speed off. We have a sunroom that can't be locked on the front of our house. When we went inside, the sunroom door was open. We called the cops, but they said all they could do was make a report. His parents don't know anyone with the type of car we saw. Sadly, we didn't see a license plate number. The next morning, we discovered a cinder block outside of our back window that he could have used as a seat or a step. The screen was ripped. We haven't seen or heard from him since, but we also don't know how long or how often he'd stand outside watching.
This happened a good few years ago now, when I was in uni. I had been hanging out with some friends who lived in a different area to me, 10 or 15 minutes walk away. We'd had a few drinks and some weed, but I wasn't messed up or anything. I leave and start walking home. It's either late night or early morning, and it's just dead, deserted, no one around. I'm following a path through this lonely wooded area that's a little way away from any houses. It's very dark, but out of the corner of my eye, I notice something, so I stop and turn to look at it. It's a cardboard cutout of a person positioned just off the side of this little path, partially in the bushes. So I'm checking this thing out, thinking how random. Who the hell would leave this here? And I just stand there staring at it for a good amount of time, maybe 5-10 seconds, until my eyes adjust to the low light. At this point, I have a horrible realization. It's not a cardboard cutout at all. It's some fucking man, and we're just standing within an arm's length of each other, in this isolated place, in the dark, in silence, staring each other right in the face. Needless to say, I got the fuck out of there fast. This was right around the time when a couple of girls had been raped in the area, and I reckon the person I encountered might well have been the rapist. There was no normal reason for this person to have been where he was, doing what he was, at that time of night. I've got to wonder what might have happened if I had been female.
When I was 16 years old, I was very insecure with myself. I had a hard time making friends, and I was basically invisible to boys. I made a lot of friends online in chat rooms. Mind you, this was in the early to mid-2000s. It was during the summer, and I was staying with my sister to watch her kids because she broke her foot at a carnival, and my two nieces and nephew were a huge handful for her. So I got to stay up all night and use the computer. I was pretty lonely because I'd just moved from my old school following the divorce of my mom and stepdad, and couldn't really hang out with my friends for a while because of my situation. I talked to a few guys, even video chatted a few times, but it was all pretty innocent. Until I met a guy from California. He wouldn't tell me his age and wouldn't even send a picture. But I got the impression that he was an adult because he told me he had his own apartment. He claimed his camera was broken. He had also tried to talk me into coming out to visit him. He told me he would get me a ticket and we could meet. He told me that I would have the time of my life, that we could do things together. He seemed excited about the fact that I had never been with anybody before. Anyway, after about a week, he convinces me to lift my shirt so he can see me. It took a lot of convincing. He was saying things like, "Come on, it's only me." Stupidly, I gave in. I didn't really think much about it afterwards, but I never did it again. I continued to talk to him, but when summer was winding down, my sister didn't need my help anymore, so I wasn't at her house or able to use her computer. One day, about 2 weeks before school started back up, my best friend Amanda called me and said, "Hey, so I have a question for you. Why am I looking at a picture of your tits right now?" I was completely floored. For a while, I didn't even know what she was talking about. I didn't even know what to say. I could only ask what she meant, and she told me that some random guy sent her an attachment, and when she opened it, it was me. The guy's screen name was the guy I had been talking to. She had also gotten calls from some other people we were friends with because they had also gotten the picture. Apparently, this complete motherfucker had hacked me. He got my friends list. My fucking neighbor got the picture. I know because he approached me about it. He was really nice and understanding about the situation. He had a sister about my age and felt really protective of me. But oh my God, it was so embarrassing. I begged him not to tell my mom, and he didn't. Amanda had to get into her parents' email profiles because he had also hacked her list somehow and sent it to everyone on her list. Her parents both had emails with the attachment of the picture. They never got the pictures and never found out. We were able to keep it pretty quiet. The only people who knew were my peers. I eventually got online and found about 100 messages from him. I finally messaged him back and asked him why, and he said it was because I hadn't returned his messages. He got mad at me because I stopped talking to him. I told him he had ruined my life, and all he had to say was sorry before he blocked me. He didn't contact me anymore, and he didn't send out the picture anymore. But as far as I know, about 20 or 30 kids I had gone to school with had gotten the picture. I was glad that I didn't go to that school anymore. But every time I visited, and we went out around town, and I saw people I had gone to school with. I knew that they knew. They would point and laugh, and I was never more glad that I didn't have a computer at home. I didn't even use my AIM profile when I visited Amanda's or my sister's house. So, to the adult man who tried to completely ruin my life when I was still in high school because you felt that I had rejected you, I hope that you get caught somehow. And I hope nobody else ever fell for your bullshit. I hope you went to prison and had all of those things that you wanted to do to me done to you. I hope to God we never, ever meet.
Yesterday, I had a crappy day and was required to work extra hours. Where I live, we had just changed our time zone by 1 hour, so it was already dark when I left my workplace. I was pretty stressed and was driving my usual route when I noticed this girl standing on a dark street, just standing there, texting. This is a shitty and dark place to be. Who the fuck's just standing there texting in the dark? That's when I turned my face, and I noticed a guy about 50 feet from her, just staring at her. I was about to go on my way, when I noticed that he was just eating her with his eyes. That's when it hit me. Oh fuck, bad news. So I just park my car on the next street, and I run back to where the girl was before. So, when I turned the corner, I noticed the girl forcing and pushing the guy while screaming. I sprint as fast as I could, and scream, "Hey motherfucker, leave her alone." The guy turned, saw me, pushed her away, and ran like crazy. I started chasing him, and noticed that he had dropped a knife in the street while running. So I turned back to the girl, and I asked her if she was okay. After she calmed down, she told me that her phone was stolen. I told her it didn't matter that much, as long as she was alright. She was waiting for her boyfriend, so when he arrived, I explained the situation, shook hands, and left. So much for a crappy night.
So, this is not my story. It's my sister's. It happened yesterday, and I got permission from her to share it on here. First of all, my sister is 17 years old, and she's gorgeous but very petite and can't defend herself or do anything to do so. She was taking a train home from work, and a man stops her when she gets off the train. He starts talking in German at first. We live in Germany. But she tells him she speaks English, and he starts talking to her in English. She told me that the man was young, probably in his late 20s and fairly attractive. Anyway, the man starts talking to her. She has no creepy vibe, so she talks back. It's a mile walk from the train station to our house, and she tells the guy this. Then, the questions start to get creepy. He asks her if she's a virgin, if she's ever given a blowjob, if she has a boyfriend. My sister tells him that it's none of his business. He laughs, and now she's getting weird vibes from him. Then, a van pulls up next to them. The man then starts talking to the driver in rapid German. My sister only knows a little, and she picks up a few sentences which were, "I'll get the girl, don't worry. She's American. She doesn't know what we're saying. Tell him we'll be there in a bit." Then she runs. She can hear the van driving next to her, but she decides to cut through the farm fields. If you've ever been to places in Germany that are remote or have small towns nearby, you'll know what I'm talking about. For those of you who've never been to Germany, there are giant fields of crops growing all over the place, and they usually have manure spread out on them, and they smell very awful. Anyway, the van doesn't follow her in the fields, and back at home we were worried out of our minds. She was supposed to be home long ago. But shortly after, she barges through the front door and she's sobbing and covered with manure. My mom immediately runs to her aid, and later that night she had a bath and fell asleep on the couch. Mom told us what happened.
Hi guys, Lazy here, and happy Halloween. I figured the best way to celebrate would be to bring the community into one video, and to showcase a few smaller channels that really deserve a look if you haven't heard of them before. Special thanks to Anthony for providing the thumbnail for this video. You can check out his art by following the links in the description below. I hope you all have an enjoyable evening, and don't do anything I wouldn't do. Stay safe this Halloween, and remember, the best things happen in the dark.